Tell me how this is.
Waiting for the live stream to hit.
What?
My phone's off.
My phone's on.
Okay.
Hey, Rob.
Hi, Bill. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you fine.
Let's start the music back again.
Okay. Sorry, is it for real this time?
Yeah. Again.
Okay. Sorry, is it for real this time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, hey, everybody. If you can hear us, welcome to Live Jazz KC, livejazzkc.com. I believe we're streaming live on Facebook and on YouTube tonight, which is YouTube is a new avenue for us. But the piece that you just heard was by the Leroy Vinegar Trio. Leroy is a great bass player in LA and later Portland. And the song was called Persuasion. And in the trio were Mike Melvoin on piano, who had a lot of kids who played with major rock bands, with Smashing Pumpkins and others. And our guest tonight, my good buddy, great drummer, raconteur, producer, and perhaps the holder of the world's record for longest gig with one jazz group, 41 years with the Phil Woods Quartet. So coming to you live from Pennsylvania, everybody say hi to Bill Goodwin. Hey, Bill.
Hey, I'm saying hi to myself and to you.
Yeah. Hey, Bill, it's really good to see you again. I haven't been
Okay.
east for a while, and we haven't gotten to play for a minute, but you're here, and man, you've done a lot of stuff, and you look great. You look young. It's hard
Thank
to
you,
believe.
sir.
Thank you. It's hard to believe that you're the age that you are. Can I out you by mentioning the year you were born? Is that
Yeah, I'm proud of it.
all right? Well, Bill Goodwin here is really not the first Bill Goodwin. He was born in 1945 in Los Angeles.
42, Rob.
Oh, 42?
42, yeah.
Oh, somebody's lying on the internet, Bill. Okay. Well, Bill, interestingly, his dad had the same name, Bill Goodwin, and he was actually kind of a famous announcer and actor, the Burns and Allen show. Is that right?
He was very famous. He was on the radio every week with Bob Hope or Burns and Allen over a long period of time, and he was making movies, mostly at Warner Brothers. So
Okay.
he was he wasn't a star, but he was, well, I guess he is a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, so I guess he was a star. Extremely well known.
Not to mention, to me, it's like jazz as an actor. If you're working full time, you're a star.
Yeah, well, he was a busy guy. He was he working day and night basically, and if he wasn't, working, he was playing golf or hanging out with his buddies, big jazz fans, and was friends with a lot of musicians. I kind of grew up in that whole showbiz milieu.
Right. I was going to ask, how did your dad's business and the connections from it kind of work towards getting you into music and jazz at a young age?
Well, I became a fan. Well, I started hearing all kinds of music when I was a kid because my folks had quite an extensive record collection. And my three sisters and I were all encouraged to, well, number one, we had to take piano lessons. Number two was we were encouraged to go in the den and read any book or listen to any record. And they had a lot of books and a lot of records.
Okay.
So I just started exploring that when I was very young. I remember pretty vividly being like a little kid and finding a Dizzy Gillespie with strings record with a picture of a 10-inch record.
Mm-hmm.
Dizzy on the cover with his cheeks all blown out.
Yep.
And taking it into the kitchen and showing it to my mom and said, like, what's up with this guy? So, yes, he's a great trumpet player. You should check that out.
Uh-huh. So your mom told you to check out Dizzy.
Yeah, well, my mom was a dancer. She was in movies, and she retired when she started having kids, but she was a dancer in films and a very accomplished, very musical person and, artistic person.
Interesting. Well, Bill, were there any particular jazz musicians in LA who were just kind of friends of the family?
Well, the trumpet player, Manny Klein, lived right across the street from us.
And what part of LA were you in?
I was in Toluca Lake. It's it's kind of a showbiz enclave of North Hollywood.
All right.
So the valley in the days when there were no freeways or anything, and people who worked. My dad worked in Hollywood, and his friends used to say, "So, what do you want to live way out there for?"
Oh,
North Hollywood.
yeah, there wasn't as much sprawl.
Yeah, but that was way before the sprawl. The San Fernando Valley sprawl.
Sure.
So there were a lot of people in the business. Their next door neighbor was the personal secretary to Jack L. Warner, who was the president of Warner Brothers. 2 houses down on that side of the street was Bing Crosby. Next door neighbor was an assistant director that actually worked with Orson Welles on The Magnificent Ambersons, I just recently discovered.
Okay.
Around the corner were Gordon and Sheila McRae and Dana Andrews. A little further down, William Holden.
Dana Andrews from the movie Laura. Dana Andrews from the movie Laura.
Yeah, exactly.
No,
Yeah,
wow.
he was in the neighborhood. And Bill Holden, William Holden, Frank Sinatra,
Yeah,
Bob Hope.
just people like that. That's an incredible neighborhood to grow up in.
Well, until I was older, I kind of thought it was like, we were kind of like normal people,
Oh, I see. Well,
And
sure.
I guess in a sense we were. It's just that was like the family business, and that was the neighborhood.
Well, Bill, why the drums and at what age?
Well, I was first attracted to the tenor, actually. I had to take piano lessons when I was a kid. That was required. But then I fell in love with the sound of the tenor, and it was Lester, and it was the guys that played like him. I'd become a real fan of the big bands.
Okay.
My favorite big bands were Kenton and Woody Herman. Though I really liked Basie and all that too, but I was really became like a Kenton nut, you know, and all the guys who played with Kenton at that time in the 50s were very, Prez influenced players. Then I also heard, folks had the records with, Prez and Nat Cole, and, they had the Jazz at the Philharmonic records, and they had a great, great record collection. So I became really attracted to the tenor, but I think I went into seventh grade, and in my school in North Hollywood Junior High, they had what was called a beginning band. And you literally could go sign up for the class, and it was like a 60-piece band of beginners.
Mm-hmm.
So you can imagine what it sounded like.
Oh, yeah.
You go in and say, so what do you want to do? I say, I want to play tenor. Well, go get one and come back tomorrow. Literally.
It probably sounded like the Portsmouth Sinfonia, if you know
that. I think it was probably much worse than Portsmouth Sinfonia. But it was a lot of fun. I learned to be a better sight reader, and I learned to play the saxophone. And I continued to play saxophone all the way through high school. Okay. At the same time, got interested in drums. And, in the band, the drummers were the weakest musicians in the band, all the bands, always. And I could read music, and I had piano lessons, and I had some musical training, and I was fooling around with the drums on my own. Eventually, sometimes the band leader or the teacher would ask me to go back and help the drummers learn their parts.
Okay.
And I think by the time I was a sophomore in high school, I was mostly in the percussion section.
Well, let's get you into high school, because you had mentioned to me the other day, we were going over some of the great people you had worked with in LA when you were really young. And you said that when you first worked with Art Pepper, he came and played with your high school band. That's kind of incredible.
One day we had moved to Palm Springs from Toluca Lake. So I was living in Palm Springs, and my folks had a little motel. And right across the street was it was more of a hotel, but they were, across the street from each other. Mm-hmm. And one day my friend came running into where I was and said, Art Pepper is at the Rossmore Hotel. And he's trying to play with the piano player there, who was a guy who played two-beat piano and sang parodies.
Uh-huh.
And so Art, apparently his wife at that time was the guy who owned the hotel was married to the gal who was Art's wife's sister. So It was like, so they came down to get out of LA for, a couple of months. And there's Art Pepper. And I'd been listening to Art with Kenton since I was a teenager, and I loved his playing. He was a real favorite of mine. And, so I ran down there and said, I play drums. Can I play with you? And there was a little moldy snare drum with a pair of brushes on stage. They said, yeah, come on up and play. So we went up there playing, me with, 15 years old or whatever, with the moldy snare drum and brushes, and Art Pepper and the two-beat piano player playing standards.
Actually mold on the snare. Unbelievable. Well,
I'm not sure what was on there, but it didn't look too good.
Yeah.
Art was just like really supportive, so they used to have a jam session in that club on Sundays, and the musicians would come down from LA. So I would go over and sit in with them. And strangely enough, the bartender was Zoot Sims' brother, Bobby.
Oh, Bobby Sims.
Before I met Zoot, I knew his brother. So when I finally met Zoot in the 60s, I said, I know your brother, Bobby. He said, really? I said, yeah, he was a bartender at the Rossmore Hotel in Palm Springs.
Well, so what happened? Did you end up moving from Palm Springs back to LA when you
moved back? When my dad passed away in 1958. Mm-hmm. So after he died, with no choice really, we had to move back to LA, and Mom had to kind of start over. It wasn't an easy time.
I see.
But I came back to LA, and I was back in the Valley in a less of a showbiz neighborhood. Yeah. But I was in the neighborhood, the general area that I grew up in.
Sure.
And there was a lot going on. There was actually a jazz club right down the street. And I was too young to get in, but I used to go down and listen at the back door.
What was it called?
I can't remember the name of the club, but the piano player, Marv Jenkins, was playing there. He was a pretty well-known piano player in LA. He used to do the intermission gig on Sundays at the Lighthouse.
Oh, in Hermosa Beach, right?
And of course, by then I'd become a big Lighthouse fan, and my friends and I used to actually drive from Palm Springs to go to the Sunday marathons at the Lighthouse.
Well, for our listeners, I mean, we have musicians and fans and people who are just not generally dealing with jazz out there listening tonight. Can you hip people to how important the Lighthouse was and what it was really like?
Well, the Lighthouse was a place where kind of the ex-Kenton, a lot of people that used to play with Kenton ended up playing in that place, and that was Howard Rumsey, who had been the bass player with the early Kenton band.
Okay.
He went in one day and he started a jazz policy with the owner there, and then he just started hiring musicians to come and play, and eventually it turned into a 6-night-a-week gig, 52 weeks a year.
Wow. They
would have a Tuesday through Saturday, and then Sunday they would have a marathon. It would start at 2 and go to 7, and then start up. They'd have an intermission group, then it would start up again at 9 and go till 2, I think.
Wow. Well, can I just for the listeners, you might actually remember. I just realized Cannonball Adderley made a great record live at the Lighthouse.
I was there that day.
You were there?
Yeah, I was there that day. That was my hangout. That was my hangout. I've been going there since I was 15 years old. So
you're like a ghost on Game of Thrones or something. You were always in the right time.
Bellig.
Yeah. And then also, fans of Elvin Jones, Dave Liebman and Steve Grossman and Gene Perla will know Elvin live at the Lighthouse, a really seminal double album, which was made maybe not till 1970 or so, 71.
Yeah. I was already in New York by then, but I knew about it, of course, because I knew those guys.
Well, I had heard from some of my LA friends just a couple of years ago that the Lighthouse was kind of opening and having jazz again. Is that right?
They're open. You know who owns it is the widow of Ozzie Cadena. Ozzie Cadena bought it probably in the early 2000s. Ozzie had been the producer at Savoy and Prestige, and then moved out to California. Mm-hmm. He died a few years ago. His wife still has it, and they have an occasional jazz policy. I think they have all kinds of music.
Well, Bill, if you don't mind, I'm going to nudge you forward to the age of 17. And,
there you go.
Yeah, how did you end up playing with the great, still living, knock on wood, tenor player Charles Lloyd at the age of 17?
Yeah, I just had a little interchange with him a couple of days ago. Okay. He had Charles was a student at USC. A couple of years, maybe 2 or 3 years older than me at that point. Though my young musician friends we all thought of him as an older guy. But he was in college. He was a college guy, but he was already married. He had a sports car. He played alto.
Okay.
He played really, really good. I saw him play at the Lighthouse during what they had the Easter collegiate jazz contest. And they would have bands from all the Southern California colleges would play.
Okay.
And Charles was in one of those bands, and I was very impressed with his playing. Well, it turns out that the guy that my sister started dating, my sister Jill, probably my most important person in my career other than my parents, and maybe even more important than my parents, because she loved music. She was a very good pianist, but she didn't play out, but she could really play classical music. She loved jazz and she loved musicians, so she always dated musicians.
Uh-huh.
Well, she was dating Charlie Hayden. Charlie Hayden introduced her to Terry Trotter, who ended up being her first husband, who was a friend of Charles Lloyd. Uh-huh. So Terry introduced me to his best friends, Bobby Hutcherson and Herbie Lewis. Took me to Bobby's house when I was 16 to play with them. And then we would go to where Charles played on the weekends, the Dragonwick Coffee House in Pasadena.
Interesting. Well,
we'd go and sit in, and eventually he asked me to sit in, and I sat in, and then he needed a drummer. And he called me, and I ended up working the gig for about 6 months.
And so what year would that be again?
1959.
1959, which is probably not long after he had played in that really famous Chico Hamilton quintet.
Oh, that was before that.
Yeah, that was maybe.
Chico was in 60s. It was maybe 60, 61, something like that.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. You know what? Yeah.
He played in two different. He played in two different. He played in the one with the cello, and then he took over the band and became the musical director, and he reformed the band as a hard bop band.
It was my mistake. That first classic Chico quintet with the cello was with Buddy Collette. I just realized.
Yeah, Jim Hall, Buddy Collette, Carson Smith.
Yeah, well, so Bill, can I throw a couple of names at you from
Sure.
LA, and maybe you could give kind of a short, rebuttal or story or whatever you like.
I didn't do it.
Paul Bley.
Well, Paul, I didn't know Paul then, but he was well known around LA. He had a steady gig at the Hillside, which was kind of the black neighborhood of LA. He had a band. I think they recorded one album. It was Dave Pike on vibes and Charlie Hayden on bass and Lenny McBrown on drums.
Well, and so how does that figure in? You did know Charlie Hayden better, correct?
Well, I knew Charlie quite well.
Okay.
But Charlie had been rehearsing and playing with Ornette and Don Cherry, and Billy Higgins was already around, and he was playing with a lot of people. They had kind of their own scene, and James Clay and Eddie Blackwell were also a part of that. But James ended up going back to Texas, and Blackwell went back to New Orleans.
Okay.
But Paul ended up hiring essentially Ornette's quartet, became his group, and immediately got fired.
Right.
He got 2 weeks notice, and that was that. So he went back to New York. Before I really got to know him later, but
Uh-huh. Well, forgive me, Bill. Is it possible that club was called the Hillcrest?
Yeah, Hillcrest. You're right. I'm sorry.
Yes, and not showing off. Just wondering because I
No, you're
remember
right.
I remember reading about Ornette's quartet, basically plus Paul Bley, or Paul Bley, whatever direction you want to put the five playing at that.
Paul recorded the group. He had like a tape recorder. He recorded the group, and he had the label Improvising Artists. He put out two LPs of that material.
I'd sure like to hear that. Did Ornette Coleman create kind of musical shockwaves and polarized viewpoints in LA before he even got to New York?
Well, he had a few supporters in LA, but not a lot.
Mm-hmm.
The guys that did support him were like Bley, Red Mitchell, Mel Lewis,
mm-hmm.
and the guys who played on his first record, like Walter Norris and Don Payne.
Interesting.
Higgins was always in the band, and Cherry. I think Charles Lloyd was a fan. Bobby Hutcherson was a fan. Okay. I was a fan. He had his supporters, but the mainstream scene, guys he'd try to get up and play at sessions or on gigs, and people wouldn't play with him.
Yeah, I've heard this, and there's just two more names. Was Eric Dolphy in LA at that point?
He had left. Eric was from LA, but he had left before I got on the scene.
Okay.
But I knew a lot of people that knew him, like Buddy Collette and Dennis Budimir, and people that had worked with him, because he was in one of Chico's groups with Dennis Budimir, the guitarist, who was a friend of mine. We played together with the Bud Shanks group with Gary Peacock and Carmel Jones.
Okay, didn't Dennis end up being like a major studio cat? He was just working all the time.
Eric, he wasn't doing studio work in LA. He was just playing gigs.
No, I'm sorry. I meant Dennis Budimir.
Oh, Dennis was a jazz guitar player, but he went into the studios when he got out of the Army, which was around 62, 63, something like that.
And one more name in LA. He was my friend near the end of his life, and you knew him a lot earlier. The gentleman whose record we played as intro music tonight, great bass player, and a guy who's as tall as you and I, Leroy Vinegar. What would you like to say about Leroy?
Well, I got, I have nothing but love and kudos for Leroy. Became one of my best friends, and was always like a big brother to me. And how I met him is really a funny story, because I was already playing around, and I was playing at Shelley's Manhole in Hollywood, and Leroy was there, and he came up to me, and I had just moved across the street from him, but I didn't really know exactly where he lived, but somebody told me, Leroy lives around here somewhere. It turns out I was right across the street from him. He came up to me, he said, "Hey man, I hear you moved across the street. Why don't you, give me your phone number and we'll come over tomorrow and have breakfast."
Mm-hmm.
So he called me the next morning. And in those days, I used to stay up till about 7:30 in the morning. I'd sleep all day.
Yeah.
So anyway, the phone rang about 8. I'd just gotten to sleep. Leroy called me up and invited me over. I wasn't going to say no. I got up and I went over. He made me breakfast. And I guess I can say he got me real high.
Yeah.
And we became best friends.
And you
And
did quite a
later-
bit of playing after that, no?
Well, after I didn't really play with them at that point. We would hang out. We would occasionally jam and stuff. But then I went and took a road trip for about a year, and I was playing with the singer Milt Trenier. And I had my first trip to New York. And this was the entire year of 1963. I was on the road with Milt Trenier with a trio with Ray Neapolitan on bass and Eddie Baker on piano.
Okay.
And we played Miami, Chicago, Boston. We never played in New York, but we got to New York. So I got to go to New York for the first time. When I came back, I still had the pad. And so I looked up Leroy, and he was working in a duo with Mike Melvoin. Now, Mike and I had been friends for a while, and we'd been playing together, before I went on the road. So Mike or Leroy called me up and said, we have this duo gig, and we're thinking of having a trio, or we think you might be good for it. So he had me come down and play with them, and then we became a trio, and we played together for about 2 years.
Beautiful. Well, so I have it here, Bill. Actually, kind of a short list of folks that you played with in the 60s. Could we go over them, before you got to New York? On that short little list, could you give maybe like a one-sentence impression of how they affected you, what you enjoyed? Back to Art Pepper.
Well, Art was in and out of prison, so we stayed in touch. And actually, during times in the teenage years, when I was back in L.A., he lived in the same neighborhood, so I would see him a lot, and I would drive. You needed a ride sometimes. I would drive him around, and his wife worked at the nightclub where she got me in to see Miles with Coltrane and Cannonball right after Kind of Blue came out, because I was a kid, man. I was like 17.
Well, and the other list I have in the
He was a buddy, and he mentored me. And then a few years later, when I was in my 20s, same time I was playing with Leroy, and Art would be out of jail, I would play with him. We
Sure.
did the TV show in San Francisco, and real important person to me.
Okay, what about these folks? What about Frank Rosalino and Bud Shank?
Well, I worked in Bud's group on and off for a year or so. That was 61, 62.
Mm-hmm.
Gary Peacock was in that group, and Dennis Budimir, and then Carmel Jones as well, the trumpet player.
Okay, so
Kansas City, I might add.
So Peacock came up in L.A. As far as playing originally.
Yeah,
right?
Gary was from Idaho or someplace.
Early Idaho.
Yeah, he's from Idaho.
Yep.
But he was well known in L.A., and I used to see him play, and I would go to see that group play, and they would ask me to sit in. And I think Gary finally told Bud he should hire me, that he wanted to play with me. The bass players are always, I'm happy to say, would like to play with me, so they got me a lot of gigs.
That's beautiful. And then not only that, you get on the gig and you've already got a friend and a good rhythm partner.
Oh, yeah. And then I did some of my earliest recordings that were released later after Leroy's record came out. That was kind of my official, debut on record. But I recorded with Peacock and Dennis. Anthony Ortega, you ever hear of him?
Anthony Batman Ortega?
Batman, yeah, the Batman.
Nice.
I
don't know his playing, but I'm aware of him.
Oh, he's great. He's right there with Ornette and Dolphy, except he was as good a musician as Eric, and a more versatile than Eric probably, and certainly a better musician than Ornette. But they were taking it out. Those guys were on the cusp of what became the new thing.
I see.
Anthony's brilliant.
Well, I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't George Shearing a big gig for you?
Yeah, that was later in the 60s. I'd already been really on the scene for quite a while, but then it was kind of be like the younger drummers be working their way up. We're all friends, so it'd be like, John, Nick Martinez, Johnny Guerin, Colin Bailey. We're all working with George, and who's based out of LA. Okay. And I think Colin decided he wanted to leave, and all the guys in the band were friends of mine. So Bob Whitlock, Charlie Shoemake, and at that time Joe Pass. And so Colin said, "Well, I'm going to leave. I'm going to leave the group, and we want to get you the gig." So they recommended you to George, and he auditioned me, and I got the gig. Mm-hmm. And I stayed with him for about a year. The year before I moved to New York. Works with George.
Okay. And then, if you don't mind, I'm going to just read a little list. And when I get done, jump on whoever on this list you want. So folks who are out there, Bill really has played with a veritable who's who of incredible jazz musicians. So Gabor Jabot, Dexter Gordon, Jim Hall, Bobby Hutcherson, June Christie, Joe Williams, Tony Bennett, Mose Allison, Mundell Lowe, and Johnny O'Neill. So what pops out from that crew?
Well, I didn't play with Mundell or Johnny until later. That would have been in the 90s or the 2000s. But I played and recorded with Mose when he came out. Red Mitchell got me on the gig, another bass player.
Yep.
And
you made a record with Mose, right? Called.
I made a record with Mose. Yeah, Red and I made a record with Mose in 1968.
I've been doing some thinking.
Right. At the same time, I was when I was off for a couple of weeks from shearing, and it worked out that I played with Mose, which was also at the Lighthouse. Come to think of it.
Uh-huh.
And,
well, so you really had a real kind of cooking career. You were busy in LA before you ever really went on the road, correct?
I was working every night and many days as well.
Incredible.
And nothing paid anything. You had to go on the road to make some money.
So what was the first important, in your estimation, road gig playing jazz that you had?
Road gig playing jazz. Well, I thought that would have been Gabor, but it turned out to be a pretty commercial group, so I didn't get to play too much of what I liked there. But it was a good group, and we got to play Newport, and we got some notice, and I made half a record with him at the Monterey Jazz Festival.
Right.
And but I was like a musician for hire, man. So I was playing commercial music. I would tour with Roger Williams, the pianist.
Oh yeah.
His touring group. Born Free and Autumn Leaves.
Right.
With the thirds. Yeah. He was a great guy to work for. It was a very precision show. You had to, I was developing my musicianship skills because, I needed to work. I wanted to work. I wanted to play creative music, and you could do quite a bit of that. But, you had to do club dates and you had to do, whatever came in. I wasn't turned down any work.
Sure. Well, were some of those folks I mentioned, like Dexter and Jim Hall, were those gigs in LA or elsewhere?
Jim in New York. I played with Dexter. I never gigged with Dexter, but I played with him in LA.
I see.
Jam session at the Hotel Watkins.
And what about Jim Hall? Where would that have been?
Jim, I met in LA, but actually he was at the Leroy Vinegar date, strangely enough.
Oh, okay. Well,
their friend, the Ranger Bill Finnegan, you know who that is?
Sure, I do. Sar Finnegan.
Well, he was a friend of Jim, was a friend of his, and I think I had met Jim because he was best friends with Red Mitchell. So I had met Jim at some point, and then I go to do this record with Leroy, and Jim shows up with Bill. So that was kind of, and Jim was going like, "Hey, you guys sound really good,"
Well, they're kind of a lot of circular connections in jazz in general, but in a really kind of serendipitous way, I think, in your life and your career. Do you think so?
I pursued that exact thing, Rob. I prepared for everything. I could have gone with any name band at that point.
Interesting. Well, what do you think about our friend Jerry Dodgen back in New York? He's 87 now, and our friends here like Brad Gregory and Roger Rosenberg in New York, they visited him recently. He's still cooking. And what Jerry told us about a lot of big gigs that he had, like Thad and Mel and Count Basie, Jerry said, every big gig I ever got, I was almost ready.
That's funny. Yeah, well, he was, he's hiding his light under a bushel, man. He's one of the best musicians I know.
Sure.
Well, he and Phil Woods were best friends, and in fact, when Phil first came east, he stayed with Jerry for a while.
Oh, no kidding.
Jerry was still married to Dottie then, the drummer.
Yeah, and I believe, I could be wrong, but the last I checked, Dottie was like 88 years old and still gigging in San Francisco. Is that possible?
She's out in the Bay Area. I think she's in Monterey.
Uh-huh.
And somebody's writing a book about her, and they called me to ask me some questions. I haven't seen her in years. But.
Incredible. Well, let me see. I did make my notes here, and I actually numbered stuff so we could find things. Anything about those great singers that you work with, Joe Williams, June Christie, Tony Bennett?
Well, the gig with Tony was great fun. That came out of my playing with the Paul Horn group, because Tony liked Paul a lot. You know, Tony was a big jazz beau, and he was friends with Miles, and Miles and Paul were friends, and I think Miles turned Tony on to Paul, and then Tony became a fan of the group, and I was in the group.
Uh-huh.
So he first hired us to come back to New York and do his TV special. I think it was in '66.
Okay.
It was all jazz musicians, Milt Jackson and Buddy Rich, Candido, Bobby Hackett, and the Paul Horn Quintet. And we were all...
I just realized, this might make you feel young, Bill, or not. I just realized that Candido and Tony Bennett are still cooking, and they're both
in their 90s. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really kind of incredible.
But that was a great experience.
And then Paul Horn, of course, was...
Yeah. I was just going to say that Tony liked the group, and then he later took us to Las Vegas to play Caesar's Palace, and we also played the Cal Neva. So he would take the group, except he used his piano player. Mike Lang was our piano player. He was on the TV special, but then Tommy Flanagan was Tony's accompanist at that time.
Beautiful.
Tommy was living in LA and was on salary with Tony. So actually at that time, Tommy and Red Mitchell and I had a trio.
Right.
And we rehearsed for 6 months or something like that every week. And then we had one gig.
Oh, boy.
And it was very exciting because Percy Heath came to the gig, and we were all like really thrilled. And he said he really liked the trio and hoped that he'd see us again soon. And then the next week, Tommy went back with Ella Fitzgerald and left town.
Oh, boy.
Didn't see him again until I moved to New York. So.
Well, there, I mean, it seems like there are a lot of stars aligning, and then occasionally there's a missed boat that could have been really something.
Well, a lot of things like when I took the gig with Gabor for that summer in '67, I had already agreed to go to work for the summer with Bobby Darin, the singer. And Roger Kellaway was his conductor then. And I called Roger up and said, I'm going to renege on the gig because I have this other thing that I want to do. I think Roger was mad at me for about 10 years for that.
Well, the interesting thing is Roger Kellaway is extraordinary jazz pianist who played with Sonny Rollins' quartet, and I believe also really did some good classical composing and a really
he was a beautiful, great musician.
Yeah, I mean, well, you've really interacted and played with so many great people here. I didn't know about the trio with Tommy Flanagan and Red Mitchell. No recording.
One gig, isn't really well known.
It's too bad there wasn't a cassette of that in a box somewhere.
I wish. Yeah. But I had a lot of experiences, like being called. I've talked to you about being called to work with Bill Evans after Marty Morell left the group, and went out and played together. And we were already friends. We'd been socializing for years.
Sure.
And he said I could have the gig if I wanted it, and I had to turn it down. I was already working with Phil. Phil.
Well, chronologically, if you don't mind, I'm gonna leave a little more of that for later. But I wanted to ask you. You had mentioned that there were three major drummers who were mentors to you, and I guess I'd like to know: was that when you were a teenager in LA or later? And the three folks are Shelly Manne, Mel Lewis, and Stan Levy.
Well, Stan, next to like Gene Krupa and guys like that, who I love. Shelly Manne was my favorite drummer when I was a teenager. When I started getting really into jazz, he was a drummer with Shorty Rogers and the Giants. He had been with Kenton, and now was in LA. He was a drummer with the Lighthouse All-Stars.
Ah.
So when I got into all of that when I was like 12 years old, he was like the guy. So and he's my actual inspiration for discovering the idea that I thought I could play the drums, which was his playing on the Man with the Golden Arm soundtrack.
Oh, was that was the Sinatra movie with the
Sinatra movie where he's the junkie car dealer who wants to be a jazz drummer?
Right.
And it's a very popular movie. I love Shelley. Frank was a friend of the family. And
excuse me, Bill, is that the movie where Frank Sinatra says, "Get on top of me, baby, I want a kick"?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. Something like
that. I think it's Kim Stanley is like the wife who's pretending to be crippled, and Darren McGavin is the heroin dealer, and he goes to audition, and he's like coming down from a Jag, and he blows the audition, and Shorty Rogers is the band leader, and these are like my idols. So, I've eventually met Shelley, but before I met Shelley, I think I probably met Stan. Well, I met all those Mel Lewis and Stan Levy and Shelley. I met all around the same time, and it was all around the Professional Drum Shop in Hollywood.
Okay.
And then the Lighthouse, and just around. And those guys all befriended me and all gave me advice. I never studied with them really, but I used to hang out and we would talk, and they became friends. They were like, think of them as my uncles,
Uh-huh.
My dad having passed away, when I was 16. They're real father figures to me.
That's beautiful, and I mean, you couldn't have three greater drummers to be mentors and friends, right?
Yeah, great people, all of them.
Incredible. Well, so Bill, all of this stuff for our listeners happened before you even moved to New York, and we know there was kind of a major event, I guess, in your life and career, which is in 1969, Gary Burton invited you to move to New York and join his band. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's another choice there, because the same week. I'd known Gary for a few years because he used to play and record in LA. And he actually stayed in LA for a little while at one point. And became a part of kind of our little group, our gang,
Mm-hmm.
the, Mike Woffers and Terry Trotters and, Larry Bunker, of course, is older, another great drummer. And, and I got to know Gary, and had gotten to know Steve Swallow, and those guys. I guess Roy Haynes was in the group in '68, and I was with Shearing. And I get this call from Gary, and he's saying, Steve and I were talking, and Roy Haynes is leaving the group. And we're wondering if you'd be interested in playing with us and moving to New York. And I said, of course I would. That would be like my dream,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they knew I wanted to play with them. I love that group. Sure. I followed that group. I knew them all, So, and I made my feelings well known. It's what I usually always did. I was just like very frank. Said, you guys ever need a drummer? I'd love to, to play with you. I'll audition. I'll go anywhere. But the money's got to be good.
Right.
I say that, but.
Well, there was a time when musicians could actually say that. I don't know.
I took a pay cut to work with Gary after working with George. George Shearing was the highest paying gig in jazz at that time.
But it was worth it, wasn't it?
Well, I don't know. This is a long time ago.
Yeah.
I think I wanted to move to New York. I wanted to play in that band.
Mm-hmm.
The same week that I got the call from Gary, I got a letter from Kenny Drew. He wanted to know if I was interested in coming to Copenhagen to play with him in the house rhythm section at the Montmartre.
Oh, boy.
A Red Mitchell recommendation.
Uh-huh.
And, that was a steady gig. Tootie Heath did it, and Alex Reel and Alvin Queen. A lot of drummers did that gig. And it was like a 6-night-a-week gig in a jazz club accompanying, be Clark Terry for 2 weeks, Phil Woods for 2 weeks, Dexter Gordon for a month,
But you turned down the Montmartre because of Gary?
Well, I mean, I had thought that would be a great, Red had just moved to Europe. And he said, Kenny said, any drummers? And he thought of me. So he sent me the letter, and I declined. I went to New York, auditioned for Gary. And this is a funny story because he flew me back he said, we've known each other for years, but I really can't remember how you play. So would you come back and audition? He sent me a plane ticket.
All right.
So I arrived, and it was a freaking blizzard, in the end of 1968. And I somehow got to his house in Queens, Douglaston. And Swallow came out from the city, and we played. He said, Steve, let's play Falling Grace. You know that tune?
Yeah.
Falling Grace. And we played it. And then Gary says, so Bill, that sounded good. Have you heard that tune before? I said, I've never heard it before in my life, which was true. And he said, you're hired.
Great. Well, you were just listening. Well, so you
were another tune for fun. And then he sent me back to LA, and I gave notice to George and then moved to New York.
And you were in Gary's band for 3 years. So this is kind of a big chunk, right?
69, 70, and 71.
And in addition to Swallow, you're also in the band with the guitarist Sam Brown, and who else passed in and out of the band?
Well, when I joined the band, it was Swallow and Jerry Hahn.
Right.
And then
Gary Hunt is from Wichita. He's from Kansas
I
City.
know. He was living in San Francisco then.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's living in Kansas City again now, as far as I know.
I think he's probably back in Wichita, which is about
I think,
3 hours.
yeah. Well, I last played in Kansas City a few years ago, and he was in town, and he came down to see me. I hadn't seen him in a long time.
Yeah.
He's a great guy, great player, great guy.
He's a great player. And actually, he and I and Leroy all lived in Portland at the same time.
Mhm.
That's where I met Jerry Hahn and where I met Leroy.
Yeah. But Jerry was the guy, and then Sam was. There was a short period with a tour with a young guitar player from L.A. that Gary was sort of grooming, and it didn't work out. So Gary fired him, and then we got Sam, which Sam was recommended by Swallow because I didn't really know Sam's playing except in his commercial work, because he had been with the Belafonte show playing with Marion McKeeba.
I see.
Fantastic finger style, acoustic guitar player. And he did a lot of record dates, and he didn't really know his electric playing at all, but he came into the band and was great.
Well, so the records that you made with Gary, I have that you're on Throb and Paris Encounter and Live in Tokyo, which you told me only came out in Japan and Canada.
Yeah.
But I was able to hear some of Live in Tokyo on.
Yeah, that's Tony Levin. Tony Levin had replaced Swallow at that point.
Right.
Live in Tokyo.
A lot of listeners know that. They know Tony Levin is the bald-headed, mustachioed bass player with Peter Gabriel and some serious
King Crimson.
King Crimson with Robin Fripp.
He was the bass player. He and Steve Gadd were the rhythm section for Chuck Mangione for when they were in Rochester. He's an Eastern guy.
Well, the question is, I think some listeners would probably like to know, you also at that point played on a record with Gary Burton and Keith Jarrett, correct?
I did, yeah. That was Swallow and Sam Brown and me.
Okay, and was that kind of a cooperative between Gary and Keith as far as choosing songs? And
it was mostly Keith's tunes.
Okay.
And one Swallow. There's one Swallow, and the rest are Keith.
And, I don't feel like it's really anybody's place to get into the psychology of Keith Jarrett, because I feel like he's given us so much beautiful music. We can generally just focus on that. How did you feel playing with Keith?
Well, Keith and I have been friends for 50 years. I knew him for a long time before we ever, played together, worked together.
Oh, I see. So
that record came out, because I was friends with Charles Lloyd, and, and that summer I was with Gabor Szabo. We were always just either following or coming in along with, Ronnie McClure and Keith and Jack. And we were all like friends, just like I was friends with Gary's group,
Right. So just to clarify for some listeners, the first really major gig, I believe, where you would have heard Keith Jarrett on piano and Jack DeJohnette on drums was with Charles Lloyd's quartet, with either Cecil McBee or Ron McClure on bass, correct?
Cecil was the original guy, and then it was Ron. But I heard Keith with Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers.
That was the Buttercorn Lady Band.
Also at the Lighthouse, by the way.
Would that be with Frank Mitchell on
Frank
tenor?
Mitchell and Chuck Mangione. Reggie Johnson on bass.
Yes, that's the band that made Buttercorn Lady. And Keith, of course, from Pennsylvania, and that's where you've been for many, many years. And maybe we can move you to Pennsylvania now.
Okay, well, so what happened is with me and Keith is that when I moved out to the Poconos, I found out that he was living, we stayed in touch and found out he was living about 20 minutes from me in Mountain Lakes, New Jersey.
Okay.
So we hooked up, we started hanging out, and we would hang out at the Deer. Actually, I started going to the Deerhead Inn, and Keith would hang out there and listen to and play with Johnny Coase Jr., the great piano player, had the gig there, who lived across the street from Keith. There's that across the street thing again.
Incredible.
And Keith would play drums with Johnny, and I would play drums. We would take turns bringing our drum sets, and then we would sit in with Johnny, just to jam with Johnny because he was great. And there was a bass player who played, wasn't really a good bass player, but John was so great it didn't matter. And we would just hang out. And then one summer he hired Dottie Dodgen, of all people, to come out. And she was there for the whole summer, and she wouldn't let us sit in. And we'd be at the bar like, damn, Dottie won't let us sit in. What a drag.
Well, is this the timing is right? So you said you actually got to New York with Gary Burton at the tail end of '68, but
it was the beginning of '69.
but it looks like really just 1 year into your time with Gary Burton, you moved out to Pennsylvania in 1970.
I did. I moved to almost exactly a year later. I moved to Pennsylvania.
So you're celebrating exactly 50 years in Pennsylvania at this point, correct?
That's correct.
Oh,
And would it be safe to say that there's kind of a scene going on spread out in Pennsylvania and has been for a long time? People may not realize you and Phil Woods and Al Cohn and Dave Liebman and Bob Dorough and Phil Markowitz and Keith Jarrett. I mean, a lot of serious jazz musicians. I'm sure working on the road and in New York, but really living in Pennsylvania and certainly performing and interacting there too, correct?
Yeah, more and more all the time. When I first moved out to PA, went out to PA in '69 to visit Bob Dorough, who was my friend because we'd worked together in LA.
Mm-hmm.
And he invited me out to PA, and we drove out. Really liked it. And at that point, I moved my family, my wife and kid, back to New York, and we'd lived in LA. Now we're doing a sublet, in the East Village. We're like, I think, we're looking for something else. So we were thinking of Woodstock or, more bucolic parts of Long Island or someplace where we could have like a yard,
Sure.
like that. We came out to visit Bob, and we kind of fell in love with the area. And then I went to Europe for like 3 months with Gary, and he came back, and we just got out of New York and came out and hung with Bob, and he helped us find our first house. We rented an old farmhouse, 130 acres of land and a 10-room farmhouse.
Beautiful. Well, Bill,
$100 a month, baby.
yeah. Well, we're gonna take a little break because we want to play some music of you playing with someone that you worked with for 41 years, and you guys put.
Who could that be?
Well, the band was put together in Pennsylvania, not in New York City, and that's of course the Phil Woods Quintet, which I guess might have been a quartet at the very beginning.
Started as a quartet, yeah.
Right. And so what we're going to play right now, our producer Herschel McWilliams is going to spin for everybody out there in Cyberland. We're going to hear Bill playing the drums with the Phil Woods Quintet with Tom Harrell, Hal Galper, and Steve Gilmore, 1988, live in Barcelona.
Fantastic.
Welcome back. And so that was the man you're looking at, great Bill Goodwin on drums with a really large beard and a very nice tie, playing with the Phil Woods Quintet with Tom Harrell in Barcelona. What was the name of that song, Bill?
That's Tom's tune. It's called Journey to the Center.
Journey to the Center. Okay.
Yeah. I think it's hard to find whatever the center of the key is, because it keeps changing key all the time.
Oh, I see. And we're going to do a quick PSA right now. I don't mean, the exam you get when you turn 50. I mean,
You get up and take a PSA? Right?
No, not this week. You can't get one. But anyway, we just want to say that during this time of kind of lockdown and quarantine, there are literally no live shows at all. So there is a contribution Venmo tip cup virtually that you guys can use. If you're enjoying the music and the conversation with Bill, please feel free to make a donation. Nothing is too small. And all that money goes to me and Bill to support us during this time of not performing. But this is a major area in your life and your career, the Phil Woods Quintet. And did you guys not form this band in Pennsylvania in 1974?
We did. It was, February. Well, actually, Phil came to the area in '73. But here's where my sister Jill figures in again, as in the connection with Charles Lloyd, Terry Trotter. Jill was with Phil. They were traveling together, and later lived together, moved in together, got married. We're married for 25 years. She introduced me to Phil. I knew who Phil Woods was. I'd seen him play, and I'd been following him since I was a teenager. He was a favorite musician of mine and of most of my friends. I never had to leave the house. Phil came to my house. He needed a place to stay. And Jill and Phil came and lived with me and my family for a couple of months and got settled, and then got their own place in Pennsylvania. And meanwhile, we started the group just as a kind of informal thing to play together. I introduced them to Steve Gilmore and Mike Melillo, and that was the original quartet.
Right. And like a great example of that band, well, with an extra player, is a great record is called Song for Sisyphus that still has the band with Mike Melillo.
Yeah.
That's a record I really particularly like. And some of the other really great records by the Phil Woods Quintet, just briefly for listeners, Live at the Showboat, More Live at the Village Vanguard, Dizzy Gillespie meets the Phil Woods Quintet. Then there was a tour with Dizzy in 1986. Mile High Jazz, Live at the Deerhead Inn, Live in Japan with Tom Harrell and Hal Crook. I mean, just a great discography. But so we've looked at jazz history. We were trying to think about Sonny Greer and John Gilmore and people who kept their gigs for a long time. But you probably have the longest tenure in any major jazz group that was visible, 41 years playing with Phil Woods, correct?
Well, I think that Steve and Phil and I have the record as far as steady personnel in a jazz group. As far as drummers go, I think it was always Sonny Greer and Connie Kay. Mm-hmm. But I think I passed those guys up like way,
right.
15 years or more.
41 years.
It's sort of a matter of pride. But the great thing about Phil's group was the way it came together. It was extremely natural. Seemed like I said before, fortuitous circumstance brought us together. Mm-hmm. We liked playing together, and we stayed together. We kept it going.
Well, wasn't there some element in terms of musical choices and financial sharing that was a kind of a co-op band? Wasn't there an attitude?
We started as a co-op. Well, we used to play and rehearse, and we thought, and Phil and we all thought, we should have like a corporate name, a weather report, something like that. And we would come up with names, and we never could come up with a good name. And I like to say that the best one we ever came up with was Solid Waste. And that was the best one.
I'm really glad that you didn't use any of those then.
So finally we decided that we'd be the Phil Woods Quartet, but that we would all have shares. So we'd have 5 shares, Phil would have 2, and we would each have 1. Mm-hmm. And we would vote on important issues and, share money and responsibilities according to the formula.
Oh, so the shares applied to decisions and finance.
And finance and the whole thing.
Mhm.
And in the beginning, I don't think Phil really liked it that much, because if we wanted to, the rhythm section stuck together, we could always outvote him.
Right.
But it worked out okay. But that's the way we started it.
Well, let's put it this way. I mean, we know from you know better than anyone playing in the band, and those of us as listeners know what a wonderful group that was, even through the slight morphings of personnel, a few different pianists and frontline partners with Phil. So Hal Crook on trombone, and then Tom Harrell on trumpet, Brian Lynch on trumpet for many years. And after Mike Melillo left, you said 10 years with Hal Galper, who we just saw in the video, right?
Right.
And then three fantastic pianists in the last 20 or 25 years, Jim McNeely, Bill Charlap, and Bill Mays.
That's right.
Yeah. So what can you say about that band for all the musicians and listeners out there? There's so many gigs that we all do that are kind of throw-togethers. What do you have to say about being in a first-rate band for 41 years and really growing together, learning a repertoire, being able to read each other's minds, play the gig without looking at any music?
Well, the time that band started, I mean, I had probably more work than anybody in the band, and I was doing a lot of commercial work, and I was doing jingles, and playing in Chuck Israel's National Jazz Ensemble. I got Gilmore into that band. And when Chuck wanted to conduct, which is always very interesting if you've worked with Chuck as a conductor. But, I was a personnel director of the National Jazz Ensemble. I did all the hiring, and I got Steve on the band, and Steve was with Thad Jones and Mel Lewis at the same time, and we were working with Phil, and I was working with Mose, and I had a lot of work, and but we kept enjoying playing with Phil, and we kept generating music, interesting music, and we kept making records, and people kept liking it. And then we started touring. And, this is was always my dream, as a musician, to be in a band, not to mention starting it together, bringing it from nothing, from the elements of it, and then producing an effect.
Right.
Figured, we got past 5 years or something, we're thinking, we're doing pretty good. We got to 20 years, this is pretty incredible, but to actually go over 40 years.
Unprecedented almost.
After a while, Steve and I were going I don't think it's going to really get any better than this. Mm-hmm. He's been he and I had been playing together for about 2 years before we met Phil. So he and I go back, even longer than that.
Well, Bill, I think the testament to your initial commitment to this band with Phil, we can tell the listeners there are these two interesting stories. We're running a little low on time. We might have to keep it short, but you got called for two incredible gigs in 1975, and you turned them down because of what was happening with Phil. And the first one was the Bill Evans Trio. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I was, Marty Morell had been in the trio for a long time. Marty and I were very good pals, and I'd known Bill for many, many years socially. And that's a long story, which I will not tell, but Marty left the group and was going to move to Canada. So Helen Keane called me, who's Bill's manager at that time, and said, Bill asked me to call you. Marty's leaving. He wants to know if you want to, he's looking for a drummer, and you were the first guy he wanted me to call.
Great.
And he hired me for a couple of weeks of gigs. And we went out and played together, and we hung out every night. Gomez was playing bass, and we were all friends, and we hung out and played and had a wonderful time. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the thing, he had promised a couple other people, some time with the band. So he had a couple other drummers he was going to hear. And he said, if you want the gig, you can have it. And I said, well, I already got stuff lined up with Phil, and he knew about the group. He knew what we were doing. He appreciated that, that I wanted to continue with that.
For bass players and drummers, that's the ultimate trio gig. So to turn down the Bill Evans Trio, you must have really believed in and loved what was starting to build with Phil.
That was my dream gig.
Yeah.
It was the gig I wanted from the very first time I ever heard Bill Evans play. I wanted to play with him. I wanted to be in his group.
Well, you also
Chuck and I became great friends. Chuck always talking me up to Bill. but I knew Bill, you know, and he knew my playing, and he was always very, very nice. But you know, Marty was a drummer for like 8 years or something. So
Right.
that was it. And we were all friends, you know, it wasn't anybody trying to poach anybody's gig.
Well, a dream call on the phone as far as being offered a gig, and the other major gig that you were offered, basically, you got a call from Horace Silver, and you were recommended by your bandmate in National Jazz Ensemble that we just heard play some unbelievably burning trumpet, Tom Harrell.
Yeah, Tom was with Horace, and they, you know, we had been playing some of Horace's tunes in the ensemble and some Jazz Messenger stuff, and you know, Tom thought I would fit into Horace's group well, with Larry Schneider and Chip Jackson and Horace. And so I get this phone call out of the blue, and I pick up the phone, and it was Horace Silver. And I, you know, and we had a great, you know, I mean, I basically said, you know, I'm so glad you called. I've been waiting for your call for 15 years. It was actually true, because I knew all of his music. I was like a total Horace nut. That's another gig. I was thinking, you know, I'm going to get ready for that gig. Someday he's going to call me. Of course, he never did until that day. And then I had to say, well, you know, I'm working all summer with Phil. You know, we got like a big European tour, and we ended up being on a lot of the same concerts and stuff with Horace. So I got to know him personally. We talked for about 2 hours on the phone and had a great talk. And then I got to know him a little bit after that.
Well, the fact of the matter is,
I just wanted to mention that I also turned down around the same time I turned down the Tijuana Brass as well.
Oh, well, that I can understand a little better.
Pat Martino. Are you kidding, man? That was a guaranteed $50,000 a year.
No kidding. Well,
yeah, I had the gig too.
To any jazz musician or fan out there, that shows you, even at the beginning, what I'm sure Bill and Steve and Mike Melillo knew about this band with Phil Woods, that it was going to be so busy and so worthwhile that you could actually turn down Bill Evans and Horace Silver. That's incredible. Well,
that was, yeah, but the Herb Alpert thing was a little harder because it was a guaranteed, you know, quite a, you know, good amount of money. And that was his basic salary. But he wanted me to move back to LA, and I was in no way interested in moving back to LA.
Right.
I said, no, I could do it. I could commute, you know, no problem. He said, no, you got to be there.
Well, speaking of LA, tell me, we're going to tell the audience about two kind of side road rock pop recordings that you made that people might not know about. And I wonder if they were both made in LA. The first one is Tom Waits. You're on the record Nighthawks at a Diner, 1975. I guess you were living in Pennsylvania. Yeah, I was. It was actually 76, I think. Mm-hmm. And I was living in Pennsylvania. Phil's group was working, but I was working a lot with Mose Allison. And we went out and did a whole bunch of concerts opening up for Bonnie Raitt. And she loved Mose, and she used to hire him all the time. And I was often playing with Mose. So I became very good friends with Bonnie and the guys in her band and her management. And we often opened for her. So we were in Cambridge, Massachusetts, playing at the Harvard Square Theater. And I met this guy backstage who turned out to be Tom Waits, but I didn't know it was him. And I knew who Tom Waits was, and I knew the guys who recorded with him, and I knew his producer. They were all friends of mine in LA. Mm-hmm. And it turned out that I went to see him perform, and I, just loved his performing. And, hanging out with Bonnie and the guys in the band. And I actually called his producer, who was a guy named Bones Howe, who's a mutual friend of many of my friends, like Leroy Vinegar and Bob DeRoe, for example. And Bones was a drummer, a jazz drummer, who became a pop drummer, became a recording engineer, became a producer, very successful, great guy. I called Bones right up. I said, I just met Tom Waits, and I hear he's getting ready to record again. I knew because Mike Melvoin had been recording with him. And I said, I just heard him, and I just have a feeling that he and I would click. I think I might be good for the recording, so would you think about it? He said, well, strangely enough, Bill, I just talked to Tom, and he told me he had just met the drummer he wants on his next record, and it was you. Beautiful. Well, the strangest, perhaps, side note in your discography, and people
Jefferson Airplane?
Yeah, you let the cat out of the bag, but that's okay. Jefferson Airplane, people have questioned whether that was a mistake, but we know it wasn't. And who was your good buddy in Jefferson Airplane who led to you recording with them?
It was the drummer, Spencer Dryden, the drummer with the Airplane, was one of my best pals. Another person I met through essentially through my sister Jill, because he was friends with Terry Trotter, who was her, and Charles, and Herbie Lewis and Bobby and all those people.
Sure.
Drummer, and a little older than me, but a drummer around LA who was a good jazz drummer, but he had more of a gift for like show and maybe rock, and the scene was changing. He was doing he worked in a lot of strip clubs. Mm-hmm. Very popular with the strippers. A very good striptease drummer.
Hey, Gil Evans.
A skill that very few people know anything about now.
Right. Well, so the question is, obviously, if Spencer was playing drum set, want to tell the folks what you ended up playing on that Jefferson Airplane cut?
I played the talking drum from Ghana.
Right.
I heard somebody playing one, and I just flipped out when I heard the sound, and I ended up getting this guy was making them, and I got him to make me one.
Yes.
And then I played it for fun. I played it mostly, we used it sometimes on gigs. I would play, percussion, or I would play, different things. I had some experience playing, timpani and, bells and, glockenspiel and, things like that, as well as drum set. I had some piano training. So, I had a lot of percussion stuff, and Spencer and I were friends, and he knew that I had this stuff, and they were in LA recording. They used to record in Los Angeles, and Spencer called me up and had me come down and overdub.
And for the aficionados out there, if you want to hear Bill Goodwin play talking drum with Jefferson Airplane, the name of the song is Crown of Creation, correct?
The title song of their third album, yeah.
Right. Okay. So the only title of an album of theirs I can think of offhand is Surrealistic Pillow.
That was the first one. The second one's called After Bathing at Baxter's. And the third one was Crown of Creation.
Well, so Bill, I'm trying to think if there's anything. Well, something that might be interesting very quickly is on the heels, or maybe during the time that Dizzy Gillespie played with you with Phil's band, you did a tour with Dizzy with Phil Woods Quartet. Yeah. And was that 1986, I believe?
I think it was 86 or 87.
And how was that experience that's about the most incredible jazz front line you could ever have for trumpet and alto since Charlie Parker, Phil Woods and Dizzy Gillespie.
Yeah, well, Dizzy is a big fan of Phil's. Of course, Phil had played in his big band in the 50s, and he used to, we used to do concerts with Dizzy. He was a fan of the group. He always would stick around and hear us play. And he's another guy that I knew for years and years, just socially, and go see him play. And he was always like really friendly. We had a lot of mutual friends. And so at the end we were going to be in Europe. And then Dizzy said to our mutual booking agent that he would like to do something with the quintet, because he was a big fan of the group. So we met up. He finished his tour, and then we extended ours another week, and we met up in Paris.
Okay.
And we went off and played every night for a week. And then at the end of the week, the last day, we made a record.
Beautiful.
I got to produce the record.
Well, and Bill, you played on a lot of great records. just for some of the folks out there, there are 2 records with Hal Galper, Wild Bird, and Inner Journey. There are 3 records with West Coast horn player, flute player, alto player Paul Horn, Cycle, Monday, and Here's That Rainy Day. And with Gabor Jabot, you always say you made half a record. That was called More Sorcery. Correct? Yeah,
I'm on half, and it's a live recording. I'm on the Monterey Jazz Festival half, and actually Marty Morell is on the other half at the workshop in Boston.
The connections keep going in circles.
Yeah, we have lots of connections, man. That's what it's all about.
Well, one heavy gig that we could talk about before we kind of call it an evening for our listeners tonight is, as you said, our mutual friend, the great bass player Chuck Israels, who had been with Bill Evans for a number of years. And you said that you and Chuck were working with Jerry Mulligan's group, correct? We
were, yeah.
And so how did it happen that you went from there to Chuck leading this repertory big band that was it's kind of like what Wynton Marsalis and Lincoln Center do now, but Chuck may have come up with the idea before anyone else.
Well, Wynton Marsalis will tell you that Chuck is said in print that was Chuck's idea to begin with.
Right.
Yeah, it was.
Well, the group, I remember that you would play In a Mist by Big Spiderbeck, and then there would be Modern Things, and just really the whole gamut of
it's a true jazz repertory band, and we played old music, and we and we had gotten grants and foundation money and donations and created the band and then a book for the band, and they had people writing in the band like David Berger and Kenny Berger and had people transcribing, and we had people sending us stuff, arrangements to play, and we were able to commission music, and had a band that was together for approximately 10 weeks a year or something like that. We had a concert series at the New School when it was still on 13th Street. Yeah, Chuck got the idea, and we had been playing a lot of gigs together. Chuck is another bass player who decided he really liked my playing and wanted to play with me, so he would recommend me for gigs. He got me on Jerry's gig, and then he left. I ended up staying with Jerry for a couple of years, and then during that time he started the National Jazz Ensemble with a grant and one concert at Wolf Trap Farm in DC.
Well, there were two saxophone players that I wouldn't mind if you could tell us just a bit about real quick. Two of my favorites who played in National Jazz Ensemble, Gregory Herbert and Sal Nistico.
Mm-hmm. Well, Sal is another case of somebody I knew for a really, really long time. And we used to play together informally, and when he would come to LA and jam sessions and stuff. And then also when I started traveling to New York from time to time, we would get together.
And late Gregory Herbert, who died in January 1978, very prematurely. It's horrible. I really think he was one of the greats on tenor. And when I would mention that to Chuck would say to me, well, Gregory played alto in my band.
He did, and he switched first chair, on and off first chair with Lawrence Feldman.
Ah, okay.
And, it was that because in the original jazz ensemble, which was an all-star band, Pat Martino was the guitarist, and and Chuck asked Pat if he knew any good saxophone players, and Pat recommended Greg. So that's how we got Greg. We didn't know him at all. He just showed up for a rehearsal, and we all went, okay.
Yeah.
Same with Tom Harrell. Randy Becker recommended Tom.
Uh-huh.
He said, Chuck wanted Randy, and Randy couldn't do it. So he said, I'm going to send you this guy who played better than me.
Uh-huh.
So Chuck says, I never heard of this guy, but he's with Horace Silver, and if Randy says he's good, if he says he's better than him, he's got to be really good.
That's saying an awful lot.
He came in, and everybody loved him. So.
Well, Bill, we're going to wrap up in a second. So at your advanced physical age, but with the youth that you have and the great playing that you're still doing, you seem to be in really good shape, and you've been producing records for many years, and you've done some trio things of your own, like the record you gave me with John Ballantyne. And
that's the newest one.
That's
the newest one. That's the newest one. And there's a few I've done over the last 10 years or so. I've been recording for the little label called Vector Disc Records. And and we're also doing stuff live at the Lighthouse. That's an associated label. Just say Lighthouse, I mean the Deerhead Inn.
Yeah.
Live at the Deerhead Inn.
If you were going to recommend two records that you've made more recently under your own name, if people want to hear more Bill Goodwin, what records would you recommend to them?
Well, I would say the trio, which I love. And
What's the name of that record?
That's John Ballantyne and Evan Greger. It's called Trio.
It's just called Trio. Okay.
Yeah, just Trio with the three names. And then one about 10 years ago, I really like with Adam Nywood and Pat Bianchi and Chris Higgins. It's called Raise 4.
Raise 4?
Raise 4.
Uh-huh.
Like the monk tune.
And so, Bill, you actually live in the venerable Deerhead Inn. And I guess there's no live music there right now like everywhere else.
Not at this point. No, it's very quiet.
Yeah. But, you're in a beautiful part of the world, and you've been there for 50 years. And, Bill, every time I go to visit you there, I love seeing you, and I love seeing your cat, Max. He's very friendly.
Hard not to see him.
It's hard not to see him because he's bopping all over you.
He's enormous.
Yes, but man, you're one of the great drummers and musicians in history, but I think you're also one of the warmest people in jazz. The first time I met you, you're welcome. Well, we were at St. Peter's Church for one of the kind of famous jazz memorials that unfortunately happens in New York City when a great player dies. Very often there's a memorial with a ton of musicians attending and playing. And you came up to me at St. Peter's and you said something like, well, Rob, blah, 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 blah. And I thought, holy crap, Bill Goodwin knows who I am. And,
Yeah.
and I was very moved by that. I thought, how does he know me?
No, I can't remember, but somebody was, I picked up on you somewhere. I really don't know. But then you started coming out with Abercrombie to play at the Deerhead. And of course, John was a great pal for many years. And
Yeah,
that was nice. And Ellie Zigman,
that's
the
right.
guy who got the gig with Bill after I didn't take it.
Well, the first time I ever played at the Deerhead, you probably played hundreds of gigs there. But the first time I went in there was with my buddy John Abercrombie, and we brought a quartet from New York, and we played there probably 5 times before John passed away. And those were really enjoyable gigs. And the best one was the night it was totally sold out, and Bill Dobbins was there, and all these musicians.
Right. Yeah.
It was a scene. So anyway, assuming that we get rid of this stupid disease and that we all go back to playing in 3-6 months, a year, whatever. It sounds trite, but what's next for you, Bill?
Well, I've been teaching for many years at William Patterson University, so I'm planning on continuing that. It'll either be in person or online, this kind of format. And I've got a couple of, recording dates lined up as soon as things open up.
Sure.
We're doing a 3 CD series with Skip Wilkins and his son Dan, with Tony Marino on bass. Now, Skip also lives at the Deerhead. He's kind of the house piano player.
Mm-hmm.
And his son Dan plays an excellent saxophone player. And Tony Marino, of course, a perennial favorite Liebman's bass player for many years.
So
we're going to work on that, and we're probably going to do another trio record. And I'm writing some liner notes and whatever, trying to perfect my paradiddles.
So there's a lot in the pipeline, and while we're not able to perform, you've got plenty to do, and you will have more to do when these quarantines end.
Well, I'm spending a great deal of time calling my older friends, a lot of drummers, who are, like Billy Hart, for example, and been a friend for over 50 years, and, Joe LaBarbera, and, it's people that I've known a really long time, just checking up on them, talk to Chuck, talked to Billy the other day, talked to Adam Nussbaum.
So you made a point of reconnecting with a lot of folks.
Yeah, well, I stay connected with them anyway, but, just during this period, I think it's good for us to be in touch.
Sure.
We just check up and see how we're doing.
Well, Bill, I think you're doing great. And every time I see you, we sit on those rockers on the back porch of the Deerhead Inn, and I hear amazing jazz history and hilarious tales from you. And that's why we wanted to have you here on Live Jazz KC tonight.
Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, man. We hope that everybody in Kansas City and New York and Pennsylvania and beyond has enjoyed it tonight. Again, virtual tip cup Venmo is posted, or livejazzkc.com/donate. And anything that you give goes to the artists. And we want to thank our producer, Herschel McWilliams, who runs Live Jazz KC. We want to let you know that my next guest with an interview on this site will be great baritone saxophonist Roger Rosenberg on May 31st.
Fantastic.
And we're hoping to lock down some interviews with Glenn Moore and Cameron Brown and Sheila Jordan and Mark Egan, all of whom have said, yes, we'd love to do that.
That's great. These are our people, Rob.
They are. And, so we want to introduce some of those New Yorkers and East Coast musicians to people in Kansas City. And Bill, as I'm sure you know, the scene in Kansas City is incredible, and I really feel for everybody there, where people can't work just like everything else. But we're trying to do what we can, teaching online, maybe writing music, and having conversations like this with great musicians like you.
Well, Kansas City is one of my favorite places in the world, so I hope everybody's good there. It's really honored to be included in your series, man. Thank you so much.
Hey, man, I'm really glad to have you here, and we've got to let our producer go because he has to watch a Memorial Day movie with his 4 children. So, Herschel, we're sorry for keeping you, but audience out there, we hope you enjoyed meeting Bill Goodwin and hearing about his great life and career. And Bill, thank you so much. Great to talk to you.
Pleasure. Be sure to send those ribs from Bryant's.
Oh, well,
as soon as possible.
I'm Oklahoma Joe's, man, but if you really want,
oh, okay. It's all good, man. It's all good.
I'll get some dry ice and send you something from Arthur Bryant's.
There you go.
Okay. Thank you, Bill. Thank you,
Hey,
Herschel.
Rob.
Thank you, our audience. Thanks, everybody. Have a
Hey,
safe,
everybody.
and distanced and enjoyable holiday weekend.
All right. You too. Take care, buddy.
Thanks,
Bye.
Bill. Talk to you soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Get out of the.
Hold on. Good for the one.
He's been like digging around in the garbage.
Hey, Bill, I think
Yeah.
you have to click the lower right. I think you need to click the red leave.
This is Brian Baggett, and you're listening to Green Lady Radio.